dead of winter, when the days are short and the nights are long and brutally cold. Time to lock the doors, to turn up the heating, pour yourself a glass of something warming and listen to a festive ghost story. 4 authors bring you their creepiest Christmas tales, stories told by candlelight, which will chill the very blood in your veins. So settle back and listen, and try not to look over your shoulder. Mrs. Velderkaust's lease. The house was very nearly perfect. It had big, light rooms with high ceilings and large windows. The rooms were a little shabby, but that was so much the better. The children could scuff and kick and slam without anybody minding. There was a small garden at the front and a much larger one at the back. The back garden had overgrown grass and blackberry bushes and 3 gnarled apple trees. It was a paradise for small boys. As soon as she saw the house, Mrs. Velderkaust knew she wanted to rent it. The agent's expensive car was parked outside the front gate, looking ashamed to find itself in such an unfashionable village. The agent probably wanted to get the business concluded and be gone. He wasn't going to make thousands on this particular lease. He bore with her, though, looking slightly uneasy, as though he thought she might bring up the topic of her dead husband again. "I'd like to move in on the 1st of December, said Mrs. Velderkaust. My current lease runs until the end of November. The agent cleared his throat. Actually, this property is available from the 7th of December. The 7th? Said Mrs. Velderkaust. Why on earth? It's empty. There's no reason I couldn't move in tomorrow if my current lease were up. She frowned slightly as she listened to the agent explaining that there was a tiny peculiarity with the lease on this house. The rental was to begin no earlier than the 7th of December, and in future years, should Mrs. Velderkaust and her family be pleased to retain the house, the 5th and 6th of December were to be excluded from the lease. What do you mean, excluded from the lease? Asked Mrs. Velderkaust, a little indignantly. Surely the landlord doesn't expect us to move all our things out for 2 days a year. Of course not, the agent reassured her. She, it is an elderly lady, simply requires that the house should be uninhabited for those 2 days. The rent for December would be reduced accordingly, he added. But why? Mrs. Velderkaust shook her head disbelievingly. It's a nuisance, reduced rent or not. I think it is to do with Sinterklaas, said the agent. The landlady's home is in the house next door, and I suppose she wants privacy for her family celebration. Mrs. Velderkaust bit her lip. How would she bridge the gap between the end of her current lease and the 7th of December? But the rent was so very low, and the house was ideal. She would never find another with so much space for so little money. In the end, Mrs. Velderkaust moved on the 7th of December. She booked the cheapest possible service without any packing or unpacking, electing to do that herself to save money. There was no alternative. She could not pay anyone to do it for her. That night, when both the boys were asleep, Mrs. Velderkaust prowled the new house with a glass of wine in her hand, exploring. It felt bigger than she remembered. Her footsteps were loud on the naked boards and the patterned tiles. She said to herself that she must put down the rugs and find the boxes with the curtains in the morning. At the end of the hallway, close to the back door that led out into the garden, there was another door in the corner where the light from the low wattage bulbs barely reached. The wood was painted dark green. There was a worn brass doorknob and a keyhole around whose edges the aged wood had become ragged so that it resembled a toothless old mouth. She grasped the doorknob, turned it and pushed, but the door didn't move so much as a millimetre. It was locked. Mrs. Waldecoust glanced about her for a key, perhaps on top of the door frame or hanging from a handy hook, but there was none. She looked at the door. Cellar, she decided. She hadn't even noticed the door when she went over the house. The key was another thing she'd have to ask about, alongside the water heating. For now, she'd leave the cellar to the spiders. Christmas was a question mark in Mrs. Waldecoust's mind. When Lucas Waldecoust, her husband, was alive, they had always attended one of the Christmas services. She wondered whether she should go for that reason, to maintain a family tradition. On the other hand, Tom and Gregory had never enjoyed going. Her main memories from those services involved surreptitiously feeding the boys toffees from her handbag to stop them complaining aloud. And then there was the risk that they would simply think about the last time they had all been in church, at their father's funeral mass. No, she decided, and then later, yes, because perhaps Lucas would have wanted them to go. She went on a Tuesday. She saw the boys onto the school bus and then she crossed the street to the church. There were 2 steps leading up to a little stone flagged area and then a heavy wooden door with an iron ring on it. The door stood ajar, so she pushed it open and went in. She found herself in a panelled vestibule that smelled of furniture polish. There was a table with a spray of artificial flowers on it and a faded notice reading Welkom in de Sint-Nicolaaskerk. Mrs. Waldecoust felt strangely touched by the discovery that the church was dedicated to St. Nicholas. It seemed apt that she should bring her sons to this particular church at Christmas, since it was dedicated to that most seasonal of saints and friend of little children. She opened the second door that led into the main part of the church and stepped inside. The interior was cold and dimly lit, and every sound she made had a clear, brittle quality to it. At the far end, yellow candle flames flickered. Mrs. Waldecoust was drawn towards their serene brightness. As she approached them, the high altar became more clearly visible out of the gloom, and she stopped and stared. The altarpiece was a large carved triptych, the painted wood accentuated with gilding. She was no expert in devotional art, but she knew the subject was unusual. On each of the side panels was what appeared to be a barrel, and in each barrel there stood a diminutive figure, with its eyes and mouth tightly closed, and its hands folded over its breast. The central panel was equally obscure. The figure to the right was clearly St. Nicholas in the garb of a bishop, with mitre and crozier. The face, which was finely carved, displayed anger and revulsion. The saint had one hand outstretched as though delivering a command. To the left stood a figure Mrs. Waldecoust could not identify, although his profession was indicated by the butcher's apron he wore, its stiff wooden folds painted white and scarlet. His posture was cringing and yet defiant. In one uplifted hand he grasped a cleaver. The longer Mrs. Waldecoust studied the altarpiece, the more it repelled her. The butcher's face was smooth and sly. The knuckles of the hand holding the cleaver were marked with that same scarlet paint, as though he had been rummaging in the thorax of a carcass. The whole thing made her feel faintly queasy. She decided that she was not going to bring Tom and Gregory here for the Christmas service. She took a few steps backwards before she turned her back on the carved figures, and even then she was acutely aware of them as she walked back down the aisle. In spite of her dislike of the altarpiece, she was curious. When she got to the other end of the church, she took a pamphlet from the table there and slipped €1 into the honesty box. The Butcher's Church, read the title in Dutch. She stuffed it into her handbag. When she stepped outside again, the lights seemed very bright. At this hour in December, the sun was still very low in the sky. She hurried home, hugging herself against the chill air. When she was back in the house with all the lights on and a cup of coffee at her elbow, she took out the pamphlet and settled down to read it. When she had first come to Flanders, she had taken Dutch classes, and kept them up for several years, in fact. Her Dutch was good, but the pamphlet was written in an old-fashioned style, and occasionally she came across words that were peculiarly Flemish. After some time, however, she had grasped the gist of it. The church was associated with a specific legend of St. Nicholas depicted in the medieval altarpiece. The story went that during a period of famine, an unscrupulous butcher had chopped up several small boys and pickled their bodies in barrels, intending to pass them off as meat for consumption. St. Nicholas had somehow discovered this horrible crime and had miraculously raised the children from the dead. This miracle was famously depicted, so the pamphlet said, in the Baroque altarpiece in the Church of St. Nicholas in Ghent. The village church was not therefore unique in celebrating the event, but it was unusual in that it depicted not only the saint and the young boys he revived, but also the wicked butcher. This was attributable to a local tradition that the butcher had come from this very village in Flanders. The carefully carved triumph of the saint over the murderer was thought by the superstitious to have some protective power. Against what? Mrs. Velderkaus wondered. Her coffee had gone cold while she was puzzling over the text. She made a face as she sipped it, gazing out of the window at the tip of the church spire, visible above the roofs and trees. She got up and poured the rest of the coffee down the sink. Then she stuffed the pamphlet in the recycling bin, taking care to push it well down where the boys weren't likely to see it. They'd had enough death in their lives already. Christmas came and went without Mrs. Velderkaus seeing anything of her new landlady. She telephoned the agent to ask about the water heating and the key to the cellar, but although the instructions for the boiler were readily supplied, the request for the key was refused. The cellar, the agent informed her, was not part of the lease. Mrs. Velderkaus felt a prickle of irritation at this. The lease did not include the 5th and 6th of December. It did not include the cellar. What else did it not include? But she held her tongue. The house was otherwise ideal, and she did not really need the cellar space. Time slipped by as she arranged the house to her liking and unpacked the last cartons. Surprisingly quickly, it was springtime, and bright sunshine was filtering down through the new green leaves on the trees. Tom and Gregory spent more time playing outdoors, and the sounds of their cheerful shouts and whoops were a fresh pain. She knew that they had not really forgotten their father, but sometimes it felt as though they had. One warm Saturday morning, when Mrs. Velderkaus was returning from the village bakery, she saw that her landlady was standing at the gate of her house. She had come to think that the woman wished to preserve a certain distance between herself and her tenant, so this was a surprise. She went over, the paper bag of warm pastries tucked under her left arm, and said, "Goedemorgen, mevrouw," smiling at the old lady. Her landlady returned the greeting in a friendly tone, but the gaze of her faded grey eyes slid past Mrs. Velderkaus towards the house. "She's looking for the boys," Mrs. Velderkaus realised. She said, "Have the children been making a noise? I'll tell them to play in the back garden." "There is no need," said the old woman. Something in the way she moved her head told Mrs. Velderkaus that there was movement behind her. She turned to see her sons spilling out of the front door, skipping and jumping, looking for their breakfast pastries. She beckoned to them, and they came running over. "This is Tom," said Mrs. Velderkaus, "and this is Gregory. Say good morning, boys." The children chorused their greetings obediently. For once they were not squabbling with each other, and they waited politely for their mother to hand them the bag with the pastries in it before running back into the house. 2 more unobjectionable children it would have been hard to find, and yet the landlady looked after them with a strange expression on her face, an anxious expression, as though she were afraid of what they might do. After a little hesitation, Mrs. Velderkaus said, "They're good boys. Really they are. If I ask them to be a little quieter, they will be." The old lady looked at her carefully. Then she said, "Mevrouw Velderkaus, your sons are very good boys. I have nothing to say against them. But there is something I have to tell you. I think that eventually, perhaps not today or next week, but eventually, you are going to ask me about the 2 days that are excluded from the lease. Those 2 inconvenient days. I think you will ask me whether you can stay here for those days. and I shall have to say no. It is impossible." Mrs. Velderkaus was first embarrassed and then piqued. She felt her face become hot and hoped that she was not reddening. "Of course," she said, in some confusion. It was almost a relief when she heard a shriek from indoors. The boys were probably fighting over the pastries. She excused herself and went inside. When she went out again later, the old woman had gone. The summer that year was long and hot. Sometimes thoughts of the grim legend would intrude when she was feeling low, as she did fairly often. She was slow to make friends in the village, and she was lonely for adult company. The local residents were kindly enough. The woman who served in the baker's set the boys' favourite pastries aside for her, and people nodded at her in the street. Yet she felt she never got any further than that with them. She wondered whether her accent put them off, or perhaps her sorry situation did, the young widow with 2 noisy children. Then autumn drew in and the weather worsened, and still she had not decided what to do about the 2 days in December. It was aggravating. She could see no reason why she couldn't stay in the house. At last she decided that the 3 of them would drive across the border to Aachen and spend 3 nights in the cheapest hotel she could find. They could visit the Christmas market and the animal park. A plan, she told herself with nervous satisfaction. The problem was solved. October slid by and then November. At the beginning of December, Christmas decorations began to appear in the village. The Velderkaus went out to look late one afternoon, clad in winter coats, hats and gloves, against the cold. At 4 o'clock it was already dark, and all the lights were on. They were amazed. It seemed that every single house in the village, except their own, was decorated. "We need to get some lights, Mamma," said Tom. "Everyone else has them." "We really do," agreed Gregory, nodding solemnly. Mrs. Velderkaus said, "Yes, I suppose so," in a distracted voice. She was looking at the biggest display, which was outside the church. The private houses had strings of coloured lights. Some of them had reindeer, and all of them had illuminated Sinterklaas figures. The church had something else altogether. There was the usual wooden hut about the size of a garden shed, with sisal greenery nailed to it for a rustic effect. The bright white lights suspended all around it illuminated with great distinctness the figures of St. Nicholas, the butcher, and several chubby children in barrels. Tom and Gregory followed their mother's gaze. Before she could say anything, the pair of them had run over to the flagged area outside the church and were staring with great interest at the brightly lit scene. "Mamma," said Gregory, turning to her with a confused expression, "which one is the baby Jesus?" "I don't know," said Mrs. Velderkaus mendaciously. "Let's go home, shall we? I'm freezing." Gregory gave the display a doubtful glance and then trotted obediently over to his mother. Tom ambled after him, swinging his arms. "That man's got an axe," he announced. "It's not an axe," said Mrs. Velderkaus hastily. "Is it a sword?" asked Gregory, peering back. "No, it's a cleaver. He's a butcher. I expect," said Mrs. Velderkaus brightly, "that he's going to make sausages to go with the Christmas turkey." "I don't think he is," announced Tom. "And why are those—" "That's enough," interrupted his mother. "Come along, we'll have hot chocolate, and tomorrow I'll see if we can buy some lights, shall I?" "Sausages," she said to herself, shuddering. She wondered whether, after all, they ought not to try and move again, in spite of the low rent. On the afternoon of 4th of December, as Mrs. Velderkaus was packing the car, she saw the first tiny snow flakes drifting down. She glanced at her landlady's house. There she was at the window, the old lady, silhouetted. Okay, I'm going to start that bit again. On the afternoon of 4th of December, as Mrs. Velderkaus was packing the car, she saw the first tiny flakes of snow drifting down. She glanced at her landlady's house. There she was at the window, the old lady, silhouetted against the cosy yellow light of the room, watching to see whether the Velderkaus were really going. Mrs. Velderkaus decided that the best thing was to leave as soon as possible and get a head start before the snow became too heavy. She went indoors to find the boys without bothering to wave to her landlady. It was impossible not to be angry when faced with a long and unnecessary car journey in snow with 2 children in the back, all at the whim of some cranky old woman. When she shouted for the boys to come downstairs and put their coats on, there was an edge to her voice. At last they climbed into the car. While Tom and Gregory were fumbling with their seatbelts, Mrs. Velderkaus looked out through the windscreen at the snow. It still wasn't settling, but the flakes looked bigger than before. Soon she would have to use the wipers. It was such abominable bad luck. In all the years she'd lived in Flanders, it had never snowed this early in the winter before. She felt like putting her head on the steering wheel and bursting into tears. Instead, she said, "Ready, boys?" in the most cheerful voice she could manage, and started the engine. The snow continued to fall. By the time they passed Leuven, the windscreen wipers were going at their fastest rate, and the car left visible tyre tracks in the light covering of snow. Mrs. Velderkaus leaned forward, peering through the windscreen at the road ahead. She tried putting the headlights on full beam, but that seemed to make things worse. All she could see were the whirling flakes right in front of her, and no further. In the end, they didn't even get as far as Liège. The road was blocked, an accident judging by the blue lights flashing dimly in the distance. The traffic was moving very slowly, all 3 lanes feeding into the exit road. Once off the motorway, Mrs. Velderkaus saw the illuminated sign of a burger chain, so she headed for that. Half an hour later, surrounded by the detritus of 3 meals and watching the falling snow through the plate glass window, she still had no idea what to do. They'd been held up for so long that it was dark now. Perhaps the snow will stop, she thought, without much hope. After a while, she went back to the counter and ordered doughnuts, just as an excuse to stay. An hour after that, she was staring out of the window again when one of the staff came up to the table with an apologetic expression. "Désolé, madame, but we are closing shortly." Mrs. Velderkaus was not as fluent in French as she was in Dutch, but she managed to say, "It's too early." She remembered that the closing time given on the door was 2300 hours. "The snow, madame." The man spread his hands in a gesture of regret. "We too must try to go home." With weary resignation, Mrs. Velderkaus helped the boys back into their coats. They might have cleared the accident by now, she said to herself. The car has winter tyres. Maybe we can get to Aachen. But when she tried to get back onto the motorway, the eastbound slip road was closed. She thought about trying the smaller roads. The idea was daunting. They were more likely to be blocked and less likely to be patrolled by police. Becoming stuck on some lonely stretch of road in the freezing dark was not something she wanted to contemplate. Faced with the urgent need to make a decision, she had a moment of near panic and then took the westbound slip road back onto the motorway. "Mama," said Tom's voice sleepily from the back seat, "when will we get to Aachen?" "Shh," said Mrs. Velderkaus. "Let me concentrate." Now that she had made a decision, she was surprised to find that she actually felt relieved. It was out of her hands. She had tried her best, but it was Now that she had made a decision, she was surprised to find that she actually felt relieved. It was out of her hands. She had tried her best, but it was demonstrably impossible to go on. Nobody could argue with that, even her eccentric old landlady. All the same, she was glad to drive slowly. If she got home after the old woman had gone to bed, she could put off any possible argument until the following day. It was 3 o'clock in the morning by the time the Velderkaus reached home. The village was mostly dark. As they drove down the main street, Mrs. Velderkaus saw that the display in front of the church was still illuminated, even at this hour. All the other Christmas lights had been extinguished, nor was there a single light burning in any of the houses. When she had parked outside their own house, she shot a glance at her landlady's home, but that was as dark as the rest. After she had put the boys to bed, she found that she herself had reached that stage of exhaustion where sleep was impossible. Eventually, she ran a hot bath and lay in it for a long time, leaving the bathroom door ajar in case either of the boys should wake, disoriented, and call out for her. She went to bed at 5 and slept until 11 o'clock in the morning. When she got up and opened the shutters, she saw that flakes were still coming down. The car was a soft white mound in front of the house, and the road had vanished under a glistening layer of snow. She saw at once that they would not be driving that day, not to Aachen, not anywhere. After some consideration, she struggled her way through the snow to her landlady's door and knocked loudly. There was no reply. She knocked again several times, and then she waded back through the snow to her own house, baffled and irritated. Why did she insist we have to go if she wasn't even staying there herself? The day passed in a kind of pleasurable monotony. In the early afternoon, the three of them struggled up to the bakery to buy bread, but it was closed and shuttered. It had stopped snowing now, and the sun was shining fitfully. The village was very quiet. The Velderkaus did not see a single person, either on the streets or at the windows of any of the houses. Since she had awoken so late, it felt as though the day had been dreadfully short when it became dark again by 4 o'clock. She went to the foot of the stairs and called, "Tom, Gregory." After a moment, Tom's head appeared over the upstairs banisters. "Yes, Mamma?" "Don't forget to put your shoes out for Sinterklaas, and tell your brother, will you?" "Already done it," sang out Tom. A moment later his face vanished, and she heard the thunder of his feet on the landing floorboards as he ran off to remind Gregory. Mrs. Velderkaus went off to the kitchen to decide what to make for dinner. She wondered whether it was too early to have a small glass of Geneva. She awoke very suddenly and blinked into darkness. She lay there and listened, and the house was absolutely silent, and yet she was convinced that it was a sound that had woken her up, a short, sharp thud that seemed to reverberate in her recent memory. The sound had come from somewhere within the house. She made herself reach out for the bedside lamp. A small click, and the bedroom was illuminated with soft light. Still, she lay in bed a little longer. "Tom," she called. "Gregory." Silence. She threw back the covers and got out of bed. The floorboards were cold under her bare feet. The bedroom door was ajar. It always was, in case one of the boys shouted for her in the night. She went and stood by it, looking out and listening. Then she stepped out onto the landing. Softly she padded to the door of Tom's room. His shoes stood outside it, the heels to the wall. They were stuffed with sweets and chocolate and little toys that she had put there herself earlier. Like hers, Tom's door was always left ajar, and so she was able to open it without making a sound. "Tom," she said into the darkness. There was no reply, and she could not hear the tiniest sound from inside the room, not a rustle, not a gentle snore. Mrs. Velderkaus thought about putting on the light. It would certainly wake him up. Instead, she went into the room, sliding her feet cautiously across the floor in case of toys underfoot, and felt her way towards the bed. She moved slowly, expecting her shins to encounter the mattress or one of the legs, and when she felt herself come up against it, she bent and put out her hands to touch her son. She felt the smooth surface of the undersheet. It was cold. She ran her hands over it and found the crumpled duvet. She stretched further and touched the wall. Mrs. Velderkaus straightened up with her hand over her mouth. She turned and ran for the light switch, careless of things that crunched underfoot and cut into the soles of her feet. She turned on the light and saw that the bed was indeed empty, the covers thrust to one side. Her gaze darted about the room. Tom was not there. "Gregory," she whispered. He might be in Gregory's room, sitting up to try to see Sinterklaas. It was the sort of thing they might have hatched together. She went out of Tom's room and into Gregory's, stepping past another small pair of treat-stuffed shoes, and this time she didn't bother being quiet. She switched on the main light right away. Gregory's bed was empty too. Mrs. Velderkaus did not scream. She began to search the room, energetically and methodically. She looked under the bed, under the desk, inside the wardrobe. She hauled up the shutters and looked down into the garden where the snow lay perfect and unmarked. Then she went out of the room, along the landing and down the stairs, looking for her sons. The front door had not been opened. She saw that at a glance. The chain was still across it. She looked into the kitchen, thinking of late-night glasses of milk and midnight feasts. But there was nobody there. She went into the living room, and that was empty too. She was moving more quickly now, her movements becoming frantic. She stalked down the passage towards the utility room and the back door. Suddenly, she stopped. The cellar door was standing open. She began to move again, but now her movements were slow and reluctant. She remembered trying the cellar door when she had moved in. She remembered asking the agent about the key and her annoyance when he had told her that the cellar was not part of the lease. That was almost a year ago now, and in all that time the cellar door had remained shut and locked. Now it was open. As she approached it, she thought that she could detect something on the air. It was not strong enough to be called an odour. It was a faint hint, a mere suggestion. It was something warm and metallic, a reddish taint, like copper. Mrs. Velderkaus came to the open door and looked shrinkingly. It was not properly light down there. There was something, but it was not an electric light. It was softer than that, and it wavered gently, so that shadows moved on the stairs. When she descended those stairs, she would be ankle deep in them. She took the first step down and felt stone under her feet. The cellar was old, much older than the rest of the house. She took another step down, and another. As she descended, the cellar itself came into view. It had stone walls and a vaulted ceiling. The reddish smell was stronger now. Mrs. Velderkaus had been afraid that there would be a person down here, someone who should not have been inside the house. But there was nobody, not that she could see. The room was longer than it was wide, stretching away from her, and at the other end there was a niche in the stone and a fat candle burning in it. It was the candlelight that danced on the stone ceiling and the steps and the two tall barrels that stood against the wall. They had the appearance of great age, those barrels. The oak staves were very dark and shiny, and the bands around them were black. In spite of their antiquity, they seemed to be perfectly serviceable. There was a solidness to them, a tautness about their curves, which suggested that they were full. Mrs. Velderkaus looked at the two barrels for a long time, at the candlelight gleaming on the oak. Then at last she went away, up the stairs, down the hallway to the front door, which she opened, and out into the night. She waded through the drifted snow in her nightdress, her feet bare, her teeth beginning to chatter. As the light from the open door of the house faded behind her, she made for the only other light in the village. The church door, against expectation, was unlocked. The next day they found her inside, crouched in a pew, still praying to St. Nicholas for a miracle.
My true love gave to me. Each Christmas Eve, Dr. Henry Gibbons and his oldest friend, Anthony St. Clair, would faithfully meet to exchange seasonal gifts. The ritual, for their arrangement had continued for so long that it was by now almost a sacred rubric, would be conducted in the same fashion every year, save for the fact that, in the interests of fairness, each man took it in turns to host the other. After all, neither of them was getting any younger, and whilst the journey between their respective homes was not by any means long or onerous, the sapping bite of the December cold often had the unwelcome effect of making 1 mile feel like several, to their ageing and increasingly brittle bones at least. Henry had welcomed Anthony into his own modest but comfortable bachelor's apartment the previous Christmas Eve, and so it was that he now found himself sequestered in his friend's book-lined study, bending stiffly down in front of the blazing fireplace to warm his numbed thighs and backside. Henry found himself quietly grateful that the room's hearth was a reasonably large one, expansive enough to warm the full span of his not inconsiderable posterior anyway. Anthony Sinclair himself sat in a leather armchair positioned to one side of the fire, a thick tartan blanket draped over the diminished sticks of his legs. To its left, another identical armchair awaited Henry's occupancy, and between the two chairs, a decanter of fine sherry and 2 crystal glasses had been placed upon a small table. Everything was precisely as it should be, indeed as it had always been, for year after year, ever since the two men could remember. While one friend had physically waxed with the passage of time, just as the other had undeniably waned, their increasing age and any attendant infirmities would never be permitted to interfere with the arrangement. The unchanging nature of the exchange was the very essence of it. To alter or deviate it from in any way would suggest that their feelings about what the ritual symbolised had somehow shifted, and that could never be. The event was not simply a display of seasonal goodwill and friendship, it was an act of the utmost devotion. Accordingly, the gifts they exchanged were no mere trinkets to be discarded and forgotten with the coming of the new year, but sacraments representative of something ineffably divine. The gifts in question lay wrapped at the foot of each of the armchairs. Neither man had learned how to properly wrap presents over the years, and so the handiwork on each was impatiently cursory at best. Normally, such undoubtedly feminine chores would strictly be the province of each man's housekeeper, but as we shall soon see, the inexpressibly precious nature of the two gifts precluded any outside involvement in the affair. Anthony's offering to Henry was a small box-shaped item, perhaps large enough to hold a teacup. In contrast, Henry's own present was larger, with a dome-shaped top. To look at it, one might have surmised it was a small birdcage, perhaps. Still, there could be no suggestion of disparity between the two gifts, simply for the plain fact that the pair of items concealed inside their respective wrappings never changed. Instead, much like the designated venue for the annual exchange, the two men simply alternated year on year, endlessly passing the same two presents back and forth. Rubbing vigorously at his ample buttocks, Henry removed himself from the fireplace and settled into his seat with a relieved sigh, which Anthony took as his cue to lean over and carefully pour them both a small glass of sherry. As the two friends then held their glasses aloft in a silent toast, the reflected flames from the fireplace seemed almost to ignite the amber liquid within, and when Henry brought the glass to his mouth, he sipped at it like a wary chaffinch, as though fearing that the fiery alcohol might sear his fleshy lips. Glancing over at his companion, he noticed that Anthony had now settled back in his chair and closed his eyes, and Henry thought for an instant that he might have dozed off. They were both of that sort of age, after all. But then a rattling sound started to build in Anthony's chest, and, without opening his eyes, he parted his lips and a low slur issued forth, Anthony having started sampling the sherry quite some time before his guest's arrival. "Any word of Ormsby?" he asked Henry. His friend considered the question for a moment, as if pondering exactly how much he should tell Anthony. "I was told he had remarried," he said finally. Anthony opened one baleful eye. "How could he?" he growled. Henry took another sip of sherry and sighed disapprovingly. "It just goes to show." "Proves the point." Indeed. Henry's gaze drifted down at the parcel sitting at his friend's feet. "You were never tempted, I suppose?" The question served to rouse Anthony, who finally opened both eyes and indignantly struggled upright in his chair. "There could never be anyone else," he said accusingly. "Never was and never will be." He stared across at Henry as if daring him to say any different. The other man merely gave a sorrowful shrug and sighed again. "I once thought it might get easier with the years. Time heals all wounds, as they say." Anthony rumbled his disapproval of the homily. "Not all wounds. Some merely fester." The doctor nodded wearily. "Well, one does what one can." He looked expectantly across at Anthony. "Can I see her now? I was scarcely able to sleep last night for thinking of her." Anthony gave a long sigh, reminiscent of a dying elephant. Easing forward, he bent down and picked up his gift from the floor, which he proceeded to hand to Henry with an odd reluctance, as if to doggedly deny the old maxim about giving and receiving. As the other man took receipt of the parcel, Anthony's hands lingered on it for a moment, seemingly unwilling to part with the item. Henry gave his friend a searching stare. "Something the matter?" "Nothing at all," Anthony mumbled, immediately relinquishing his grip. "Just the thought of not seeing her for an entire year. At our age, one doesn't quite know how many years one has left, after all." Henry brought the package protectively to his chest, cradling it there. "Well, that's the agreement. We share her, heart and soul." Saying nothing, Anthony stared fixedly into the fire as Henry began to eagerly tear at the wrapping paper. In the half-light, the doctor's hungry eyes gleamed like polished obsidian. "Hello, my darling," he murmured. What now lay revealed in his lap was a large sealed bell jar filled with a cloudy liquid. But neither of those exterior trappings concerned Henry any more than the length of wrapping paper now lying discarded on the rug had. The true substance of the gift, the prize he had so fervently longed to see again ever since he'd last glimpsed it some 365 days ago, was a woman's severed head. The head bobbed gently in the jar, its features puffy and pale after long decades spent soaking in formaldehyde, and yet, if one squinted at it through aged, rheumy eyes, precisely as Henry was doing in that very moment, it was possible that the face of the dead woman might still appear just as young as it had when the two friends had originally known her, and just as beautiful. Henry moaned softly, prompting Anthony to expel an annoyed cough. "Do come on, then," he grumbled. Jolted from his private fantasia, the doctor immediately leaned down to fumble at his feet. I'm sorry, please do forgive my manners," he apologised, quickly handing Anthony his own gift. "Merry Christmas, my oldest friend." Upon receiving the parcel, Anthony's trembling hands began to fumble ineffectually at the wrapping. Cursing under his breath, he finally managed to rip aside the paper, his arthritic fingers clawing hurriedly at the small box contained within, scrabbling to open its lid. Inside lay a mummified human heart, shrunken and grey. Its new custodian gazed down at it for several long seconds, his face curdling as he ingested the cold and bitter tea of remembrance. Eventually Henry broke the silence, raising his glass in another toast. "To Anna. She gave her heart to another, so we were obliged to take it back," he said quietly, and with a studiedly appropriate amount of regret. His eyes clouded with longing, Anthony gently closed the box's lid and picked up his own glass. "To Anna." For a moment, each man silently recalled the chain of events that had led them to this macabre juncture. Their mutual obsession with the divine Anna, who, to their learned minds at least, had flightily encouraged their amorous attentions before callously rejecting both friends in favour of the young upstart Philip Ormsby, a lowly grocer's son at that. The poisonous humiliation of subsequently being forced to sit there in the church and watch the happy couple marry, their determination to not let such a grievous insult go unpunished, and finally their black revenge, snatching Anna away while Philip was out of town on business, leaving him tortuously mystified as to his missing bride's fate, and ensuring that Anna, or these two deathly mementos of her at least, would at last belong solely to them for as long as they both lived. Their throats suddenly growing dry with the memory of it, the two companions quickly drained their glasses. As Anthony moved to refill them, his gaze was inescapably drawn to the jar sitting in Henry's lap. "Please," he drunkenly implored his friend, "allow me one last look at her." Anthony's drinking really was starting to become a problem, the doctor mused. He suddenly realised he had very strong misgivings about entrusting Anna to his friend's care for the next 12 months. But what could he do? Such was the nature of the agreement the two gentlemen had made, and who could possibly argue that the two friends were not gentlemen, possessing all of the attendant integrity and ethical fervour that title demanded. Somewhat peevishly, Henry shifted the position of the jar just enough for Anthony to be able to glimpse Anna's face. As he gazed upon his beloved once again, the old man's sunken features visibly softened, the years seeming to fall away like autumn leaves. "Oh, her beautiful blue eyes," he breathed softly. "What did you say?" Henry snapped. Anthony jerked back as if burnt. I was remembering her eyes," he stammered. "They were brown, not blue," Henry told him sternly. Anthony's mouth gaped open in disbelief. "Nonsense," he said. "I'm telling you. Brown," Henry insisted. "Your memory grows ever more enfeebled with the years," Anthony spat. "Last Christmas you claimed that Anna's favourite colour was green, when we both know it was really red." Bristling, Henry clutched the jar to his chest, hiding the hen from his friend's sight. "I spent hours staring into those eyes," he thundered. "No, entire days. Through them I gazed into the depths of her very soul. Are you honestly suggesting I don't remember what colour they were?" Shaking with anger, Anthony struggled weakly to his feet. "You demented old fool! Don't you dare tell me I'm wrong! Her memory is all I have!" In response, Henry also heaved himself upright and thrust his face into Anthony's, his jowls wobbling with outrage. "You don't deserve her! You never did!" It was me that fought for her! You were resigned to her marrying Ormsby, ready to simply roll over on your back and give in, like the gutless dog that you are. Then who was the gutless dog that cowered in their bed while I visited her on that final evening? Which one of us hid behind closed doors as I took my scalpel and cut into Anna's flawless throat, weeping as I watched the precious life ebbing out of her? Cur! Poltroon! Drunk! Anthony's sallow features grew uncharacteristically flushed, and his skinny hands clenched into frail, tumbleweed fists. For a moment, Henry thought his friend was about to strike him, only for the other man to dart forward and wrench the bell jar from his unsuspecting grip instead. Holding the trophy aloft, Anthony pirouetted like a crazed stork towards the fireplace, as though performing a bizarre dance macabre with his lost love. "If I can't have her, then no one will!" "No!" Henry screamed. Too late. Anthony cast the jar into the fire with a manic screech of triumph. The glass immediately shattered with the heat, sending the formaldehyde cloak contained within spilling into the flames. Instantly, a loud explosion belched forth from the hearth, scorching Anthony's face and hands and sending him crashing backwards onto the carpet. Ignoring the other man's plight, Henry watched in horror as Anna's head began to blacken and burn, the preserved flesh rapidly shrivelling away to reveal the grinning skull beneath. There was nothing he could do to prevent it. Their beloved was lost to them. Grief prickling in his eyes, Henry stood and looked mutely on as the fire hungrily claimed her. Finally, when nothing was left of Anna but bone, Henry took a hesitant step forward and picked up the poker, hoping to use it to fish what remained of his love out of the fire. But just as he turned back towards the fireplace, the skull rolled onto its side, opened its maw, and began to shriek. Its piercing screams immediately filled the room, with sufficient force to cause Henry's teeth to throb savagely and rattle the various framed testaments to Anthony Sinclair's eminence that adorned the nearby walls. Henry gazed at the shrieking death's head in abject horror. Surely the whole town would be able to hear such a fearful noise. Now everyone would know what they had done. Everyone would know his and Anthony's secret, their shared humiliation, and it was all that old fool's fault. He turned towards his fallen companion. Anthony lay flat on his back, the taut skin of his atrophied face blackened and blistered by the explosion, his mouth open and closed silently, like that of a halibut writhing on the deck of a fishing trawler. "Bastard!" Henry hissed. A cold fire bloomed in his chest, filling him with the strength to do what was necessary. There was simply nothing else for it. Anthony had brought it on himself. Henry had not felt this kind of icy certainty since the night of Anna's death. and quietly relished it. He leaned forward, gazing into Anthony's eyes. "Bastard!" he said again, for good measure. Anthony goggled up at him as Henry raised the poker above his head and brought it crashing down onto his erstwhile friend's face, an action he methodically repeated until Anthony could goggle no longer. And all the while, Anna's skull continued to scream. Satisfied with the bloody results of his handiwork, Henry removed a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at the perspiration beading on his brow. His equilibrium somewhat restored, he turned his attention back to the fireplace and what little remained of his beloved therein. "Hush now," he murmured to the shrieking skull, bending forward to pluck it from the flames, oblivious to their scorching touch on his flesh. As the doctor's hands closed around the skull's smoking cranium, it immediately ceased its cries. Henry held Anna to his chest, tears flowing freely down his ruddy cheeks. Whether they were tears of joy at being reunited with his lost love, or merely tears caused by the pain of his burned hands, I cannot venture to say. Regardless, he stood like that for some time, swaying gently and wordlessly crooning to his prize. Around him, a second sound slowly began to build in the room. A low whine with no apparent cause or source. Although Henry was oblivious to it at first, the noise continued to rise in pitch until it eventually drowned out the sound of his crooning. Indeed, it kept on rising to a point where he soon began to wince in evident discomfort. Unwilling to relinquish Anna's skull from their jealous grip, his hands were not free to properly shield his ears from the incessant whine, and so all the doctor could think to do was to retreat to the nearby corner instead. There he began to cower and whimper, his meaty frame seeming to visibly diminish under the sonic assault, like a fallen apple withering in the hot sun. Finally, the sound reached a terrible crescendo, shattering the 2 sherry glasses sitting on the small table. Relieved as he was by the sudden cessation of the noise, Henry barely even noticed their destruction, his attention now utterly transfixed by the unexpected arrival of another presence in the room. In the shadowed far corner of the study, untouched by the throw of the firelight, stood the nebulous figure of a woman. She remained there, quite motionless, for a short time, then slowly began to move towards the still cowering Henry. He watched wordlessly as the woman edged into the glow cast by the fire, revealing her to be clad in a long white dress. The garment flattered her elegant figure most pleasingly, and in everyday life his female visitor would undoubtedly have drawn many admiring glances from any menfolk in her immediate vicinity, were it not for the lack of one important aspect which at last became apparent to the doctor once she stood fully revealed in the firelight: her head. Still, even without the benefit of facial recognition, Henry knew exactly who the visitor was. How could he not? He remembered every last detail of her, though it were yesterday. The small mole on her left collarbone, the exquisite swan-like neck he had so delicately drawn his scalpel blade across all those long years ago. "Oh, Anna, my sweet, sweet darling," he whispered, his flesh a-quiver with a kind of terrified ecstasy. The headless woman loomed over him. Her only reply to his blandishment was to extend one pale hand, palm outstretched as if to seek alms. Craving understanding, Henry gazed up at the empty space where Anna's face should have been, where it had been until he himself removed it. "Anything," he said desperately, "anything for you." The hand gestured again, more insistently this time. Henry's gaze drifted from the absence above Anna's neck down to the swelling bosom of her dress. There, at exactly the point where the impregnable muscle that he and Anthony had so utterly failed to capture once beat, a crimson flower began to bloom on the otherwise pristine white fabric. And he finally understood. "All you ever had to do was ask," the doctor said lovingly. As he tore his shirt open to expose his hairless, sagging breasts to Anna's spectre, and she reached down to greedily claim her trophy, in the brief moments before the world went dark forever and he was once more reunited with his old, nay, oldest friend, Sir Anthony St. Clair, Henry Gibbons reminded himself that his heart had always belonged to her anyway.
Good evening. This little story is called Midnight Movie. You're insane. This experiment is blasphemous. You whining fool, I have always been surrounded by idiots who could never appreciate the true purpose of my work. The noise of the television woke Dean in the early hours, that and the banging noise from the flat next door. It was Crowhurst hitting the partition wall with a broom handle. Dean got up, rubbing his eyes, and trudged out into the hall. A splash of bluish light showed that his TV was on. The noise of the soundtrack suggested the volume was turned right up before he went to bed. But he'd turned it off, hadn't he? How much did he have to drink? He walked into the living room and gawped at the set. The screen was alive with murky, out-of-focus action. He rubbed his eyes again, but the picture didn't quite come into focus. He could make out enough detail to see that it was showing a black and white movie. As the orchestral score swelled, a hunchbacked figure threw a switch. Forked lightning flashed across the screen. Sparks flew from electrical gear. The film cut to a white-coated figure leaning over a shrouded body. The body, well above normal human size, began to sit up. "Live, my creation, live!" Dean smiled. He liked cheesy old horror movies. He groped for the remote and killed the sound, but then decided to sit down and see what happened next. Surely the monster will go on a rampage, he thought. Kill its creator, always fun. However, just as he plumped himself down on the sofa, the picture started to vanish in a blizzard of static. He caught a brief glimpse of some words rolling up the screen, then the rectangle went blank. Oh, crap. He thumbed the remote to turn the TV back on, but when it came to life, it was showing sports highlights. He reasoned that the network had simply cut the movie's credits and jumped to the next show. He channel surfed. Then a jaw-cracking yawn reminded him he needed to be up by 6:30. Shrugging, he decided to try and get back to sleep. He was just pulling the covers up over his tired body again when the noise of the television blared out once more. "My darling, do not go to Castle Karnstein. You worry too much, my love." It took less than 5 seconds for Crowhurst to start attacking his bedroom wall. Cursing, Dean lumbered back into the living room and killed the sound. Again. This time he sat down to watch the movie for a while. This one was in colour, but like the first, seemed to be an old-style Gothic horror. A dark-haired woman in an elaborate dress was pleading with a tall young man in a velvet coat, long curly hair, and frilly shirt. Again, just as Dean began to show signs of interest, the picture was lost. "Oh, screw this," he sighed. He decided there was probably a fault with the set, the remote, maybe both. It was second-hand. He got up and went to the plug socket and switched it off. The little red light in the bottom right-hand corner of the set died. The following morning was filled with work and its many distractions. Dean forgot to look up the TV schedules until his midday break. A colleague caught him looking at a website that listed broadcast movies. Fortunately, Gina was one of the ones he got along with. "Planning tonight's viewing?" she asked. "Nah," he said. "I just caught the end of this old horror movie. I wondered what it was." "Oh, I love those classic horror films," she enthused, perching on the corner of his desk. "What was it? One of Roger Corman's? Or a Hammer film? Peter Cushing was so cool." Dean shrugged helplessly. He couldn't seem to find anything that fitted the bill. There were no black and white movies listed for the previous night. In fact, no horror of any kind. They discussed old movies, nostalgia, and Dean started to hope they might be moving towards the much-anticipated "let's have a drink sometime" moment. But then the office manager appeared. Dean was back home and preparing a vegetarian cannelloni, part of a health kick he doubted would last, when the doorbell rang. It was old Crowhurst leaning on his walker, jabbing an accusing finger. "You left that bloody telly on all day. It's been driving me insane." Dean sighed. He thought the old man was going bonkers or making it up. "I turned it off and unplugged it last night, Mr. Crowhurst," he said loudly. "Whatever you heard, it wasn't my television." "No need to shout at me, young man. I'm not deaf," the neighbour spluttered. sending drops of saliva, which connected with Dean's cheek. When I came in, he pointed out, the television was quite clearly not on. Just as Dean was enjoying his triumph over the supposedly demented old man, a blare of sound erupted from the living room. "Nobody can imagine the horrors I have seen, my friend." Crowhurst thumped the frame of his walker as the movie orchestra gave it their all. "I'll complain to the council if you don't keep the bloody noise down. You see if I don't." "Sorry," Dean said abruptly. He closed the door, resisting the urge to slam it, and rushed into the living room. And sure enough, the screen was alive with blurry monochrome action. A giant spider was descending upon a screaming girl tied to some kind of frame. As he killed the sound, a young man lunged at the monster with a torch, and the spider caught fire. This time, Dean checked the free newspaper he'd collected on the way home. It wasn't even 7 o'clock. If anyone was broadcasting a horror movie so early, it should have been evident, but again there was nothing. He peered at the screen. The picture was definitely blurred. He hit the button that identified the channel, but no number appeared. What? Dean recalled this was a second-hand set, of course. It was faulty, perhaps picking up signals from a foreign station. Might somebody in Ireland or Belgium be broadcasting horror movies in the early evening? Seemed unlikely, but at least it was a rational explanation. He switched off the set and went back to his food. Later, he ate cannelloni while watching a news channel. This made him irritable and nervous. He started to channel hop, half hoping he'd find the giant spider again. But all he'd seen was the usual fare, and after a while he settled for a Poirot, which quickly sent him into a light doze. "But, Professor, a woman can't simply change into a panther?" Dean jerked awake to see the now familiar blurred picture. Actors, none of whom he recognized, in late Victorian clothing, were arguing in a laboratory. There were lots of beakers and some bubbling. The director cut to a chameleon in a tank, its eyes moving in different directions. Dean knew how it felt. He reached for the remote, turned off the movie, and resolved to buy a new TV next time. It was after 10. Should be thinking about proper shut-eye, he thought. He was about to get up when he noticed the reflection in the blank screen. It was wrong, very wrong. Instead of his own small, reasonably neat living room, he saw an expanse of clutter. Open boxes littered the floor along with stained plates. The sofa was larger and darker than his, and on it he could just make out a shape, pale-faced and bloated, wrapped in what might have been a dressing gown. And then the reflection was gone, and Dean was gawping at himself. His heart was pounding far too fast, and for a moment he was afraid he'd have some kind of stroke. He breathed slowly, deeply. He got up and poured himself a whiskey, all the time not taking his eyes off the screen. "Okay," he said to the glass rectangle. "Let's do this." He sat down with a book after refilling his glass and read until midnight approached. He began to wonder if he was making too much out of odd electrical faults and a possible trick of the light. And then the screen came back to life. As before, it was a horror movie. In fact, it was the first one, a cheap knockoff of Frankenstein. The blurred images went through their routine, with the monster rising from the slab and advancing, arms outstretched on its hapless creator. Then there was an abrupt jump to the credits, or rather, the very final item on the credits. Director Martin Grossmith. Then the screen went blank. "Okay," he thought, "I'll take the hint." He got his laptop and typed in Martin Grossmith, horror director. He found an entry on a popular film site, and one passage stood out. Despite his intense enthusiasm for the horror genre and his undoubted ability to make low-budget movies to tight deadlines, Grossmith was destined for obscurity. Legal complications and other difficulties meant that most of his films went unreleased. He moved on from horror to making sitcoms, documentaries and commercials, never enjoying more than modest success. When interviewed in later life, he expressed sadness and frustration that wider audiences never got to see his films. A year before his death, his movies were released on DVD by a small firm, which later went bankrupt. There was a link to a newspaper obituary. It turned out that Grossmith had died not long before Dean had bought the television. The obituary also quoted the director as saying, "I put my heart and soul into those films. They were extensions of my mind." Dean went to the site he'd used to find the second-hand TV. Eventually, he found the snippet he'd expected. A single phrase, "house clearance." Dean formed a theory. It was a crazy theory, perhaps, but you needed one of those to explain crazy facts. He imagined Martin Grossmith, old and fat, living in squalor, sitting in front of his TV, watching his own movies. DVDs would have been provided by the firm that went bankrupt. When the director died, he was probably sitting on his sofa while one of his films played. Maybe he expired as the credits were rolling. At the very moment his name appeared on the screen. "All right," Dean said quietly, "but what do you want me to do?" The screen flickered and a flash of lightning played across it. The director's name appeared for a near subliminal moment. "You want me to watch your old films and spread the word?" Another flicker, and a glimpse of a forgotten actor hamming it up as if his life depended on it. "My creation must live!" Dean smiled ruefully. "Anything for a proper night's sleep, mate." It took Dean a few days to obtain second-hand DVs of 2 of Grossmith's films. Nothing else was available. When they arrived, it was clear they were bootleg copies. This explained their cheapness, and as he slipped the first one into the slot on the TV, he half expected it to be a dud. There was a shrill whirring, and then a basic on-screen menu appeared. "Okay, Martin, let's get in the mood," he said brightly. He sat back, opened a beer, and pressed play. The title appeared, Curse of the Panther Woman. The movie was in black and white, and he expected it to be blurred, like the ghost images, but while the original negative was a little scratched, the picture was clear enough. "Did you have cataracts, Martin Grossmith, towards the end?" he mused. "Maybe you were just drunk all the time. I can get that." As the film proceeded, Dean got a little tipsy. He caught himself laughing at what were supposedly moments of high drama. The worst example was when a noted explorer's young wife was accidentally scratched with the claw of a tiger. Then her spouse informed her the claw was believed to be cursed. Why did you just leave it lying around the house, you dumb bugger?" Dean spluttered. "Sorry, Martin, I know you were doing your best." He felt slightly ashamed and managed to watch the rest of the film without making disparaging remarks. He watched the next one in a much more reverential manner, or at least he tried to. Night of the Monster led to him cracking open his 4th can. This one was in colour, which was unfortunate. The lead actor was wearing a very obvious hairpiece that didn't match his real hair. The shape of it also screamed fake. Dean found it difficult to stifle a guffaw, especially when he realised it looked as if the man was wearing a dead hamster on his head. The scientist, misguided as usual, was trying to cure disease by supercharging the human metabolism. Predictably, animal testing of his drug caused a lab rat to grow very big. The monster was, of course, a regular rat filmed in close-up, rampaging through a model laboratory. That wouldn't have been so bad. But then it suddenly struck Dean that the rat bore a strong resemblance to the lead actor's hairpiece. He couldn't stop himself. "Night of the Killer Toupee," he shouted. The picture froze. The rat, mouth open to reveal its prominent teeth, was dead center screen. Dean froze, motionless, feeling suddenly sober. The film resumed, and he watched until the end in silence. He drank no more beer. When the credits rolled, he even gave a little polite applause. "Well done, Mr. Grossmith." He hoped that this ritual might finally end the haunting. And for a few days it seemed it had succeeded. There were no more complaints from Crowhurst, no sudden awakenings to stilted dialogue. But Dean's sleep wasn't as peaceful as he'd hoped. A couple of times he woke in the small hours, sure that there was someone in the room. But when he switched on the light, he was alone. A few days later, he'd almost forgotten Grossmith when Gina happened to mention an old B movie she'd watched. He confessed to not having seen it. She offered to lend it to him. "Hey," he found himself saying, "how about a horror movie night sometime? Beer and pizza, some obscure classics?" Gina raised an eyebrow, then smiled. "Well, as lines go, that's not bad," she said. "But I'll warn you, get very giggly when I've been drinking." "Me too," he shot back instantly. "So movie night sometime?" They settled for the following Friday. The possibility of being close to a half-drunk, giggly Gina gave him a powerful boost. He spent the next few days trying to second-guess everything that might happen, then gave up. When he got home on Friday, he tidied the flat, ordered pizza, and checked the beer. When she arrived, she'd brought more beer, and her collector's edition DVD of Ghouls from Beyond the Grave. All went well. But when Dean put the disc in the TV slot, it wouldn't play. Instead, the mechanism protested, made a grinding noise, then spat the disc out. "Oh, damn," he said, flustered. "Maybe it needs cleaning or something. It's an old set." Check with another disc, Gina suggested. He picked up one of the Grossmith DVDs. Sure enough, it played perfectly. Hey, cool, we'll watch this instead, she said. Okay, he said, hesitantly, but I warn you, it's kind of cheesy. All the better, she replied, opening a can. Come on, let's work out a drinking game. The Grossmith DVD was The Giant Rat Movie. They were soon taking a gulp every time the rodent appeared. By the time the pizza arrived, they were both laughing hysterically, with much playful shoving and snorting. When the credits rolled, Gina read off the various names in a silly, portentous voice. When she reached the director, Dean felt a qualm of shame but didn't dare interrupt her. Martin Grossmith, she intoned. Poor bugger, should have stuck to accountancy like his man wanted. Dean half expected the TV to react in some way, but the disc simply returned to the title menu. He took it out and replaced it, gingerly, in its cheap box. Gina was already picking up Curse of the Panther Woman. Hey, we've got to watch this one now. They spluttered and giggled through the second feature, and somehow ended up in bed. Dean woke up naked, with the beginning of a hangover at just after 3 in the morning. Beside him he felt a warm, soft form, and sat up. There was a trace of faint blue light coming through the half-open bedroom door. In it he could make out a fan of dark hair across the pillow, an arm hanging over the side of the bed. He heard gentle breathing. Wow, he thought, that's worth any number of hangovers. Moving slowly, he got up to go to the bathroom. But as he left the bedroom, his brain processed the fact that the light was coming from the living room. The TV was still on. Well, we must have left it on, he thought. Only thing we did leave on, eh? He plodded slowly into the living room, then stopped. Night of the Monster was playing, and again it was blurred, as if seen through aged or drunken eyes. He walked carefully, still not quite sober, over to the sofa to get the remote. Then he noticed that there was now no soundtrack, no dialogue. He peered at the screen, puzzled. Something was wrong. Even in his fuddled state he could see that. Then he worked out what it was. Why are they all just standing there? The lead actor, with the bad toupee, was in the middle of the lab staring at the camera. So were the supporting cast of lab assistant, girl reporter, private detective, all bunched together in medium close-up. And as he moved in front of the screen, their eyes followed him. It wasn't the camera they were looking at all. It was Dean. Shit, he exclaimed, picking up the remote and jabbing the red button. The screen didn't go blank. Instead, the image changed as the actors' faces blurred, spread, merged into one face, which was old and sad, full of regret and anger. Dean kept jabbing the button as Martin Grossmith spoke. All my life, said the dead director, I was ignored and forgotten and sidelined, written out of movie history, and now, instead of appreciating my efforts, you mock and point and ridicule. This was my life. It was my world. I offer you my soul, my spirit, and you sneer. I offer you the gift of imagination, and you exploit it to get laid. You disgust me, and now you will learn. Ah, shut up, Dean shouted, emboldened by the drink still in his system. You're as big a ham as the guy in the hamster wig. It's past your bedtime. He switched the TV off at the plug, but the screen remained alive with Grossmith's face. Then the round, flabby visage started to change again, the small dark eyes moving apart, the nose growing longer. Fascinated and appalled, Dean staggered back to the sofa and collapsed in surprise. The face on the screen was no longer that of a human being at all. It was the giant rat. He almost laughed, but then he saw the twitching, whiskered nose pushing out of the screen. The rat leapt, landed on the carpet a couple of feet away. It was the size of a very large dog. Not as huge as in the movie, but big enough to make Dean yell in terror. He hurled the remote. The plastic box bounced off its skull, gave an outraged squeal, revealing 2 huge, chisel-like teeth. Dean clumsily leapt over the back of the sofa just as the rat sprang. He screamed as teeth dug deep into his left calf. He kicked out with his right leg, felt his foot connect with something warm and furry. He grabbed a vase and threw it, and it smashed in the creature's face. There was more blood and more squealing. He scrambled out of the room, slammed the door. He limped painfully to the bedroom and heard a loud splintering behind him, imagining huge teeth ripping through the flimsy wood. The pain in his wounded leg had become a vast throbbing agony that threatened to black him out. He forced himself to close the bedroom door, then tried to shove a chest of drawers along against it. "Gina," he shouted, "help me!" The room was almost pitch black, but he sensed movement. The drawers suddenly moved easily, so fast that he almost lost his balance and fell against a warm, soft body. "Oh, God," he gasped. "Call the police! Quick! You've got your phone, right?" He felt hot breath on his face. Then a rough tongue ran itself over his cheek, sought his eye socket as he flinched away. In that moment he remembered something trivial, something that had barely registered as he fled the living room. In the hallway was his coat stand where Gina had hung her jacket just after she'd arrived. The jacket was gone. He began to struggle, but was held firm by hands with startlingly sharp nails. The rough tongue explored his face, his neck, his bare chest, quickly working its way down. There was a crash, then a vicious gnawing and scratching. The door was knocked off its hinges, and weak blue light leaked in through a thin rectangular gap. In it, Dean glimpsed the creature that was nuzzling his belly. He screamed. She looked up, slit eyes gleaming, and ran a pointed tongue over her fangs. As the monsters began to devour him, Dean could just hear Mr. Crowhurst banging on the wall.
This Hollow Thing. It was Debbie's turn to host. She was a good cook, but she had a way of sucking all the joy out of the food by lecturing about its nutritional properties as she served it. It always made Micah feel less like he was having an enjoyable meal, and more like he was eating someone's science experiment. Antonia said Debbie can't help it. She has anxiety. It's a way for her to feel like she's in control. It doesn't matter, Micah said. We're not going for the food anyway. He was trying to focus on the road in front of them. A dense fog had rolled in, and his headlights could not pierce the deep gloom that enveloped the dirt road ahead of them. Debbie's aunt had left her a ramshackle house in the country, and after her divorce earlier in the year, Debbie had moved out there to raise chickens and make soap and candles and hemp blankets and other crafts she sold online. Micah hadn't looked at her site, but Antonia said she had quite a following, along with an Instagram account that sold an image of an idyllic country lifestyle. In fact, Debbie's place smelled weird and was cramped and not very clean. The aunt had been a hoarder, and Debbie had been too depressed about the divorce to do much about it. Micah had gone out to see her once when she first moved out there at Antonia's urging. She's not doing well. He'd knocked on the door a few times, and then, when no one answered, and finding it unlocked, let himself in. The front room had been packed with boxes and broken furniture and books and crumbling newspaper and magazines, and he called out Debbie's name. He found her in the kitchen nursing a bottle of wine, clearly not her first. "Micah," she slurred, stumbling to her feet and over to him, shoving one hand down the front of his pants. He ought to have made her a cup of tea, put her to bed. Afterward he had left quickly, and they never spoke of it, never even alluded to it. "Turn here," Antonia said, and he was surprised at the surge of anger that came with being yanked out of his reverie. He said, "I know where she lives," and his voice sounded petulant to his own ears. "We're the last ones here," Antonia observed unnecessarily, as they came to a stop under the security light at the end of Debbie's long driveway. He recognized Joan and Wendy's car, and Mark and Jimena's, but not the red pickup. He knew something was different before they even went in. He could see, in the light spilling from the windows on either side of the door, that the front room had been cleaned out at last, its walls repainted, filled with furniture from Debbie's old place that had been brought back out of storage. Debbie herself looked stunning when she opened the door. She had grown out her honey blonde hair and was wearing a festive red dress, but it wasn't even that. She looked happy. Micah realized it had been years since he'd seen her like that. "Hey guys," she called out, and her lips brushed his cheek, along with her hair, and a scent, something sweet and musky. Behind him, Antonia was saying something, and up ahead, in the kitchen, he guessed, he heard the chatter of familiar voices. But for himself, he felt suddenly distant, as though he had gone to a very still place where it was too warm, and he was separated by invisible glass from those around him. "The place looks great," Antonia said, and Debbie said, "Yeah, well, that's mostly Eric's handiwork," and Micah said, "Who?" And some guy in a flannel shirt with fussy wire glasses and a beard was shaking his hand and going, "Pleased to meet you, man. Heard a lot about you." "Have you now?" Frank Sinatra was singing "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas" from the turntable by the window. There was mistletoe above the doorway leading into the kitchen, and a tree in the corner with presents stacked beneath it, and a fire crackling in a fireplace. The others were standing around in the tiny kitchen, pink-cheeked from the warmth and the mulled wine they were all clutching. Wendy, blonde and slight, perpetually trying and failing to finish her dissertation in, what, anthropology, sociology, some ology that Micah could never remember the prefix for. Lucky for her, Joan had a responsible job in a bank, since Wendy was as likely to waste her stipend on cocaine and clothes as to use it on boring things like food and rent. Amina was heavily pregnant and explaining that she and Mark were finally going to tie the knot. Nothing big, guys, just something at the courthouse, super low-key, because of the conservative county where she taught 5th grade. It wouldn't do for her to be an unmarried mother. It was incredible when you thought about it that 3 of the 4 couples had met when they were 18 and stayed together ever since. It was so unlikely. But if there was any particular reason for it, besides good luck, or that they were all simply well-suited for one another, Micah didn't want to think what it might be. He observed with a kind of relief that the old kitchen table had survived the purge still in its corner, and for a single vivid second he thought of Debbie again as she'd been on that day. Then the bearded man, Eric, slapped him on the back and pressed a bottle of beer into his hand. "My own brew," he bellowed. "Debbie says you're a man into the brewing arts yourself." "Okay, everybody get the hell out of my kitchen," Debbie said, making flapping motions with her hands. "Go sit by the fire, that's what it's there for." Micah was able to catch Antonia's eye then and mouth, "Who is this guy?" while inclining his head toward Eric, and he saw instantly from the expression she gave that he'd fucked up. "I told you," she whispered as they made their way into the living room. "They met at a Zumba class 3 months ago, and it was love at first sight. He's basically been living here ever since." Micah didn't have a chance to make a retort, which he wanted to. He was sure Antonia had gotten it wrong, this guy in a Zumba class, but he couldn't have anyway. He could already hear her response. "You never listen to me." In the living room, Joan and Wendy, ever the lovebirds, sank together into the big armchair by the fire. Mark stood by solicitously and held Jimena's orange juice as she lowered herself onto the couch. Micah shrugged out of his coat and stood by the fire. Eric planted himself right next to him. Micah gritted his teeth. He could hear the guy breathing, a heavy muffling sound like he had a cold, but Micah had a feeling he just sounded like that all the time. "So you all went to college together," Eric said, and Micah bit back the urge to say something sarcastic in return. "It's crazy y'all stayed friends all those years. Like friends." It took Micah a few minutes to realize he was referring to the TV show. "It's not really like that," Micah said. "I mean, we all have lives and friends and things now. We just get together every year. We're all from right around here, so that makes it easy." He could feel Antonia watching him from across the room. When you were with somebody long enough, you could feel what they were thinking at you. Don't be an asshole. "But it's not just that," Eric said. "I mean, Debbie's told me about y'all, about what happened and why you still get together." "It's not why we still get together," Joan interrupted, and Micah felt a wave of gratitude toward her. Good old Joan. She'd always been his favorite in the group, after Debbie, of course. She had the same black Louise Brooks-style bob she'd worn when they first met at 18. That was Joan for you, always reliable, unchanging. "It's not like that." But Jimena had started speaking before Joan was done. "Why is that, Eric? What did she tell you?" "Take that, Antonia." Micah was glad the rest of them were on his side anyway, even if Antonia wasn't. Eric, though, was one of those guys who was incapable of reading a room. "She said y'all saw a ghost." From the looks on everyone's faces, even Antonia's, Micah saw that they were all as surprised as he was. Is that what we're calling it now? At that moment, Debbie came sailing into the kitchen carrying a tray of cheeses and fruits, announcing, "This ought to keep you savages from starving." A moment later, she too sensed the wrongness in the room, the silence under Frank's cheerful crooning about a winter wonderland. It was Wendy who broke the silence. "I can't believe you told him." Debbie carefully set the tray down on the side table nearest the sofa. When she drew her hands back, they were trembling. "It's not a big deal," she said. "You're not the one who decides that," Wendy said. Antonia, recovered, broke in. "You guys, this is stupid. Debbie's right. It was a long time ago. We're not kids. We don't even really know what we saw," she said to Eric. "We were freshmen, walking home from a solstice party, passing around a bottle of Jägermeister. It was almost Christmas. The dorms were already basically deserted and were shutting down for the holidays the next morning. We thought it'd be fun to go to the cemetery, the really old one, the one on campus." "Hey, I think it's awesome," Eric said. "I believe y'all. My great-grandma was from up in the hills. She knew all about that kind of stuff." Wendy said, "It's not about that. Believing us." Apparently, even someone of Eric's puppy-like enthusiasm could get the message eventually. "Look," he said, "I shouldn't have said anything. I didn't realize this was like a thing between y'all. Forget it. It's none of my business." "You guys need more mulled wine," Debbie announced brightly. "Come on, give me your glasses. Hermina, more juice? Oh, honey, no." Hermina had started to cry quietly. "She just gets really emotional sometimes," Mark said, and Debbie said, "Of course she does, pregnancy." And Michael wondered what would have happened if he'd made Debbie pregnant. He might be with her now instead of Antonia, and Eric wouldn't be in the picture at all. Of course she could have gotten pregnant and not told him. Women did things like that. But Debbie wouldn't have, he was sure. "It's not that," Hermina said between sobs. "I mean, it is, but it's not just hormones. Sometimes I get scared about what happened to us that night, that it might have damaged me in a way that could hurt the baby." "Hey, that's nothing to worry about," Eric said. "Like I said, my great-grandmother, she saw spirits and all kinds of things like that. Didn't do her any harm." Hermina was shaking her head, and for a moment Micah thought she was really going to spill it all out, tell him the whole story, if Debbie hadn't already done so, but surely she hadn't, because if she had, Eric wouldn't be here right now, or maybe he would. Maybe he was some kind of weirdo. Who the hell knew? All Micah knew was that something wrong had come into the room, or had been there when he arrived, and whether or not it was Eric's fault, it was something he had never felt before when they were all together. It had been different when Debbie was still with Justin, of course. Even last Christmas, when things had been so tense between them, and they'd already decided to split up, although no one knew it yet. If Micah was honest with himself, he'd been pretty freaked out when Debbie and Justin divorced, because what would it be like, their gatherings, with one of them missing? Or had a shadow slipped in among them when Justin slipped out? They'd all stopped hearing from him, and that was just weird. Who vanished like that in these days of ubiquitous social media and internet tracking? "Leave him alone," Debbie had said. "He doesn't want to be bothered. He doesn't want to hear from me or any of us." Jokingly, Micah had said to Antonia maybe she offed him. The minute he saw it, he saw from Antonia's face that she thought the same thing. That was crazy. That was stuff you saw in true crime shows. Definitely not something Debbie, with her song, soups, and essential oils and weird food neuroses, would do. Debbie said to Hermina, "Babe, do you want to go lie down in my bed?" And Hermina shook her head fiercely, and Mark said, almost apologetically, "She doesn't like to be alone these days." And Hermina put her head down and said something in Spanish that the rest of them couldn't understand. Antonia said to Eric, "This must be kind of weird for you. We don't see each other as much as we used to, and so it gets kind of intense sometimes." And Eric nodded in a way that Micah could see was meant to show thoughtful concern. "So what?" Eric said. "You get together a couple times a year and you tell ghost stories?" Joan started speaking then in the flat, harsh manner of someone who had lost all patience. "When you see something like we did," she said, "it's not just a thing that happens to you and then you move on. Something clings to you after, forever. I'm surprised your great-grandmother never said anything to you about it," she added, in a tone that made it clear she didn't think for a second that his great-grandmother had ever seen a thing. Such subtleties were lost on Eric. "No," he said with a shrug, "she was fine. So y'all are sort of like a support group for each other." Micah had wanted to punch the dude since he first laid eyes on him, but that had just been normal everyday jealousy with a side of annoyance because Eric was an annoying guy. What seized him now was a kind of cold rage. He wanted to emphasize to Eric what an interloper he considered him to be, and he turned to Debbie. "Heard from Justin lately? Who?" She stared at him. "Justin, the guy that was your husband for like a decade, who was supposed to be at these things, but he kind of vanished off the face of the earth. You heard from him?" Antonia, always standing up for her ex-roomie, her best friend, said, "Stop it, Micah." And Mark broke in, "Yeah, I heard from him." "Really?" That wasn't at all what Micah expected. "Really, a few weeks back. He phoned me." When nobody said anything, Mark added nervously, "I don't know if he wanted me to say anything about it." "About what?" Joan said. "About anything. That he called, what he was up to, where he was." Joan said, "I don't care what he's up to. I'm just glad he's alive." And Mark shrugged. "He sounded all right. I mean, he's actually working on fishing boats in Alaska." He glanced at Debbie. "He asked about you." Debbie's voice was tight as she said, "Can we not talk about Justin anymore, please?" Micah felt it like a direct rebuke. He finished off the bottle of beer that Eric had handed him and wished for something stronger. definitely stronger than home brew or mulled wine. "Hey, Deb," he said, "got any Jägermeister?" "What? No, Jesus." "Or anything, really. Stronger?" "There's a bottle of cognac. I used a few tablespoons of it for the mulled wine. Knock yourself out." Debbie had abandoned or forgotten her hostess role and went back into the kitchen without collecting any cups for mulled wine after all. She emerged a moment later with the bottle of cognac and handed it to him, unsmiling. "There." He didn't have a cup, so he turned up the bottle and drank straight from it. He thought Antonia would have something to say about that, but she was silent. The drink burned on its way down his throat and then warmed him even more. He stepped away from the fire. God, they'd just arrived. They had the rest of the evening ahead of them. How was he going to get through it? Ignoring the others, he took a few more swigs from the bottle until he felt like he had a comfortable buzz and went back into the kitchen, ostensibly to return it. Debbie was frowning at something in the skillet that looked like the kind of fake meat product she was always trying to push on people. She was poking at it and didn't hear him come in, so he went to her, and what he hoped could be interpreted as either friendly or seductive, depending on how she responded, wrapped his arms around her shoulders. "Micah!" she exclaimed, and he backed off, hands raised in the universal signal of, "I didn't mean anything by it." "I'm sorry," he said. "Sorry. "Jesus, Micah, what was that all about?" She peered at him. "You're acting really weird tonight. Are you sure you're okay?" He said it to her, though it was barely audible. "I've been thinking about you." "What? Thinking what?" He cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about you." "I've been thinking about you too, about everyone. I mean, I always get excited at this time of year, knowing we'll all be together again." And he said, "That's not what I mean." "Oh." The cognac made it possible to say, "I never felt like this before. That was the most incredible experience of my life." "Micah," she said, "I always had a thing from you, from the very beginning." "I barely remember it," she said. "What?" "Micah, I was drunk. It was during the worst period of my entire life, and it's not exactly something I'm proud of. Antonia is still my best friend, even if we don't see each other that often." He was sure she was lying. She said, "I don't even know how much I'd had to drink when you turned up. I mean, you didn't do anything wrong, but I just wasn't in the best frame of mind. Look, I just need to finish up in here. Can you please go out there and stop trying to play dominance games with Eric? To be perfectly honest, he's too stupid to compete." Micah turned to go, and there was Antonia standing in the doorway behind both of them. Her face was expressionless. He had no idea whether she had just appeared there or had heard every word that passed between them, and nothing about her demeanor suggested one possibility over the other. She was holding the tray with everyone's glasses. "I came to get more mulled wine," she said. Debbie inclined her head toward the slow cooker. "Help yourself." Micah watched Antonia set the tray down and took the opportunity to slip back out. He couldn't endure their uncomfortable silence or uncomfortable chatter, whatever it was likely to be. Once back out in the living room, he realized he still had the bottle of cognac in his hand. He opened it up and drank even more. The alcohol emboldened him. To Eric, he said, "Man, I don't know why you'd come here tonight." Eric still managed to look more surprised than insulted. "I didn't come here," he said. "I live here." "Right," Micah said, remembering. Right. Behind him, Antonia said, "I think you've probably had enough to drink for now, Micah, at least until after you have something to eat. And we haven't even started telling ghost stories yet." The Frank Sinatra album had started over for what felt like the 10th time since they'd arrived. "Doesn't Debbie have any other music?" Micah said, and went over to the record player to flip through Debbie's vinyl. She did, but none of it was Christmassy. At least he could turn the album over. Frank Sinatra started in on "Let It Snow," and Micah glanced out the window. The fog appeared to have rolled in even thicker, if that could be believed. Antonia wouldn't want to drive in this, and he couldn't now. He'd had too much to drink. They'd have to get a ride back with one of the others, or spend the night on Debbie's sofa. But the truth was that none of them would want to go anywhere, not with the fog this thick as it was on this particular night. There was too much that could be concealed out there. They should have never come out to Debbie's place anyway. It was too remote. She'd been so excited about hosting, but they should have just told her, no, gotten together at one of their places in town like they did every year. What was out there, swirling in the mist? He could hear the others talking behind him, low, desultory conversation. but he no longer cared what they were saying. There were patterns out there if you looked. This old house, these old woods, like that night in the old cemetery on campus. Now, according to Frank, it was the most wonderful time of the year, only it wasn't that at all. It was the most terrible time of the year, a time when all the extra lights and forced gaiety only emphasized the nature of the darkness they were trying to keep at bay. Trying and failing. Like bringing the circle back together every year to tell stories of things that went bump in the night, unexplained phenomena that had befallen them. Why had they started doing it in the first place? The first year it had been because they were genuinely terrified, and the only thing they knew how to do was reach out to one another. With each passing year, the terror didn't dissipate, but it dulled, like living with a very slow-moving terminal disease. Somewhere along the way, they had convinced themselves that this was a kind of treatment for it, only it wasn't any kind of treatment at all. Whatever was out there was still coming for them, had been coming for them for 15 years, and would not rest until it found them again. She said y'all saw a ghost. Is that what Debbie had told him then? Such a simple word, 5 little letters, conjuring up what? Friendly Casper? Something that rattled chains and moaned in the night, something that looked just like a person, but you could see through it, so you knew it wasn't a person, but was in fact someone's spirit. It had not been any of those things. It had not been malevolent either. That would have been infinitely less terrifying. What it had been was empty, a hungry, blind nothingness, crawling over gravestones to reach them. 8 drunken acquaintances who had happened to leave a party at the same time, laughing, singing snatches of Christmas songs as they stumbled home under a black, starless sky. Let's go through the cemetery, somebody said, and they thought nothing of it. Only that it would be a little bit spooky, and that it was on the way back to their dorm anyway. So they did. Later, they all remembered it differently. It had claws, Joan had insisted, and Mark had said no, it had regular hands, but its torso was horribly long, and while Micah had seen its face, the face of a cherubic child, only it wouldn't stop grinning, a horrible, mirthless grin stretched across a too smooth visage with too many teeth in the frozen mouth, and all of them heard the clack, clack, clack sound that it made as it scrabbled across the tombs. The worst was that you knew it had been human once, and no longer was. Afterward, Antonia had not been able to stop crying, and wouldn't go back to her room even though Debbie would be there with her, and so Justin went with Debbie, and he took Antonia back to his, and they made awkward love for the first time, their first time together and his first time ever, though not hers. But it was nothing like he'd ever imagined it would be, and not just because he was jealous when he found out she knew what she was doing when he did not. That thing was between them the whole time, and he kept imagining it was with them, making those hollow, clacking noises. When he kissed Antonia, he found himself thinking of her as the corpse she would someday be. When he ran his hands down her body, he imagined them sinking into soft rot. Get away from that window. Whatever's out there has you hypnotized. For a moment, he hoped it was Debbie. Of course, it was Antonia, pulling him away and smiling at him. And he thought, she didn't hear what we said back in the kitchen, Debbie and me. And then he wasn't so sure. And then it didn't matter. He drank some more of the cognac, and he let the growing sense of oblivion wash over him. Debbie had brought out dinner at some point, but by then he was so drunk that he barely noticed what he was eating, at least until she announced tempeh, like that cleared it up. Eric was still valiantly or foolishly struggling to hold his own. Eric would have to tell a story himself if he were going to step into Justin's shoes, but he probably had some kind of hillbilly folktale from that great-grandmother of his that he could share. At one point, Antonia sat down beside him and gave him a secret, private smile and put a possessive hand on his leg. In that moment, he loved her again, as much as he ever had, or remembered what it had been to love her once. That first delicate unfolding of something so simultaneously frightening and familiar, like an echo from a previous lifetime or an atavistic recollection. Sometimes he thought that love had been fundamentally twisted that night in the cemetery before it ever had a chance to blossom. Other times he thought there was nothing supernatural in his failing to love her in the way that she deserved, only supremely human. Someone started to tell a story, Wendy maybe. He wasn't paying attention. It was sometime after midnight when Joan said, "It's snowing." They all went to the window and looked. She was right. As thick as the fog had been before, the snow was now, heavy white flakes twirling and blotting out the night, along with everything else. "That's it," Debbie said. "Now it's a slumber party." She left the room and came back with an armload of blankets and pillows, but there was a forced exhilaration to all of it as they shouted and laughed and drank some more. Micah tried to say that the snow was falling harder and thicker than any snow ought to fall in this part of the country at this or any other time of the year. Maybe it wasn't even snow. Maybe it was something else. He didn't say that, but he was thinking it. He suspected the others were as well, as one by one they all fell silent. "We haven't finished telling stories," he said, and his words drifted on the air like he'd never said them, as though words could save them. It was the longest, darkest night of the year. One of them was missing, and one did not belong. If they made it through to the other side, the light was waiting there for them. The trouble was that you could never really know if the light would return. Micah turned back to the window and could see them all there, reflected in the firelight against the glass, still in the light for now, but beyond it, the dark was blind and hollow and hungry, and had been waiting for such a very long time.